solicitor that specialises in agricultural issues, and she's going to talk to us about recent legal and tax developments affecting the private client with agricultural assets. Aisling is a solicitor, a chartered tax advisor, and she's also FETAC qualified, and she has set up her own business, rather, advising predominantly farmers, and she's based out of her own family farm in Newmarket on Fergus. So welcome to Aisling.
Thanks, Million. Thank you, Gloria. Thanks for inviting me here today. I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet, famous last words for someone that talks way too much. But it's about, you say, 40 minutes? Or half an hour or 40 minutes. Anyway, so I'll just be clear on the. Okay, that's pretty. I'm back to you fast. Okay, so I suppose when I was asked to do, I was speaking at the conference a couple of years ago. And when I was asked to do a paper, I said, okay, what am I going to talk about? And what will hopefully people attending the conference get most benefit from? So a lot of it is just going to be focused on practical stuff, about like family farm transfers, and I suppose there's a particular focus on voluntary farm transfers, or just kind of practical issues that I come across in practice. And you know, with family farms and things are done a certain way, and they've always been done like that, and sometimes I challenge that. And I remember there's a colleague that I have an awful lot of time for, and then I was challenging and asking him about something, and he said, but Aisling, that's the way it's always been done. And I suppose I'd always go, but why? And so I do things, I think, a little bit different, but I love a bit of feedback, just kind of going, well, have you thought about this, have you thought about that? And so far, I'm in practice 11 years, but so far I haven't had anything majorly go wrong, but obviously that can all happen in time. So just a small little bit about my background. As Bonnie said, I'm a solicitor and a chartered tax advisor, trained in William Fry. Got wonderful training, see a lot of my old colleagues here in the room. Role I got was financial services tax, but I'm a country bumpkin, always wanted to return home, so I didn't think there was much of a market in County Clare for financial services tax, so I said I'd probably jump ship sooner rather than later. So there's 5 now in the practice, including myself, 3 solicitors, an accountant, and a support staff. So the office is actually on the family farm, so there's more chance of a mid-lorry pulling up outside the office than anything else, which the farmers obviously love. And they don't have to get parking tickets and things like that. They can come in their wellies if they want. They could also find me in my wellies in the office, but that's the nature, we're very laid back. The other side of it, the practical side of it, I suppose, were dairy farming. I have 3 brothers, 2 of them full-time farmers, married with 2 kids, and my husband is a non-farmer, but I'm trying to make a farmer out of him. He's recently done the Green Cert, and we bought a farm recently, and we're hoping to start a dairy operation. So fingers crossed on that. So I'll make a farmer out of me yet, please God. So in terms of overview, just as I said, practical advice in structuring family farm transfers, options available when there's no obvious successor to the farming enterprise, an overview of collaborative farming structures, a little bit about cap reform. I don't really want to send you to sleep. And then an update on kind of the main changes I think that has affected agri-tax, and the main one being around young trained farmers stamp duty relief. So as there's a very detailed note and presentation in the pack that you can refer to if you have an appetite for this kind of stuff. But I think the first point I want to make is, you know, somebody comes to me for a consultation, and I typically have an initial consultation with the parents and with the successor at the same time. Now obviously they are going to be independently advised, but we just do kind of a general overview on kind of these are all the different options that are available to you. These are the tax considerations, these are the legal considerations, and their attitude typically is like, I don't want to pay tax. Once we don't have to pay tax, whatever way we do that, we do it that way. And then I'm saying, but hold on a second, the most important thing is not tax or law, it's about ye having a relationship after this is done. And I suppose the nature of farming, typically, you know, the people are in the same yard. You could have a farm transfer going on, and the parents and the son are in the same house, under the same roof, sharing the same dinner table in the evening, and there could be solicitors' letters flying over and back between the parent's solicitor and the son's solicitor, and then it's read into what's on that letter, what way is it being worded, and what do they mean by that, and why did you say that? Or a solicitor might say, well, this is the best interest of the client, what have they, so it's just, I suppose, to be mindful of that. As I said, parents have to have what's called financial and emotional security after the transfer. The child has to have a flexible and resilient long-term plan. I suppose on that, a practical thing is where I'd see that the parents would typically retain land. It could be like 40 acres, or it could be a part of land, or they might retain the house and the yard around the house. And you're going, well, where does that leave the child practically? Especially when you think of the likes of the Fair Deal scheme. Yes, the attitude might be, well, hold back 40 acres as security for yourselves. But it's just looking at all the implications of doing that. How is that going to affect agricultural relief down the line? How is that going to affect if there isn't a will there, and if that land is left to left amongst all the kids in an intestacy situation? So the child has to have some, I suppose, security known, is it coming to me down the line? Do I need to make provision in terms of potential further tax? And then the non-farming children are treated fairly. And by that, I think a lot of that is around communication, that if the other children in the family know what's going on, they're typically okay, and if it's communicated in a good manner. The one where there's always an issue is where they might be down at the shop or the pub, and then they get wind that the farm is being transferred over, and it's their first day here, or they hear it from somebody else, and it is absolutely catastrophic on the family and on the future generations. So nothing to do with lower tax, but really, really important in the context of what we're talking about. So succession plans, a big part of it will boil down to, is there somebody that's willing to take on the farm, or is there not? And I would say, typically, if there is an identified successor, you're probably looking at moving the farm assets before they're 35. And again, linked to the young trained farmer's stamp duty. If there's no successor identified, typically the parents will hold on to it and leave it under their will. That's, in my experience, that's typically what the preference is. Collaborative farming structures play a role, a very big role now. So your collaborative farming would be typically your partnerships, farm partnerships, registered farm partnerships. There could be what's called contract rearing of stock, cow leasing, loads of different options there, loads of information available on the Taggart website, and precedent agreements. But with the collaborative farming structures, I think, okay, if there is, we'll say, a child that's interested in the farm and taking on the farm, doing a baby full time, typically they go to agricultural college. They might, they'll spend a year, 2 years doing that. They might go to the likes of New Zealand for a year or two. They come back, then they work in the farm. They're paid a wage or a salary for a year or two, if the farm can afford to pay it. Often it can't. And then if everything is going okay, well then you look at going into a registered farm partnership, which is typically for 5 years. And then if it's still going okay, then you look at transferring over the assets. And you look at transferring the assets over in, we'll call it one fell swoop, not a staggered process. If there is no successor identified, okay, say we talk about a dairy operation, it's obviously it's a difficult, laboursome job, so the parents typically want to take a step back from something like that. So they might decide, okay, we'll finish the dairy, we'll go into what's called contract rearing of replacement stock, where they will rear basically replacement stock for other dairy farmers, but it's just less labour intensive. They get a good return, they're still regarded as farming, they can claim all their Department of Agriculture scheme entitlements, etc. And it just enables them to take a bit of a step back. And then once they kind of get used to that and taking the pedal off the clutch, then they can maybe look at doing a long-term leasing option, where depending on how long they lease out the land, they can avail of incentives, 18,000 tax-free if they do 5-year lease, up to 40,000 if they do 15 years or more. And that's not going to have a negative impact really on succession planning either, because assuming that the parent had farmed the land for 10 years before they first started leasing out the land. So you can see the collaborative farming structures have a role to play in that. So as I said, the long-term lease. Okay, just as again, I suppose some practical lump sum sites years ago, they were the thing. Those sites would say were give retained or given to other family members. There was lump sums of money. What happens in that situation? Typically, the non-farming children who'd been educated well would drive home in their new cars, and they might have go off on a family holiday, and then you have the farmer's son or daughter at home who have debt up to their eyes, and they're working day and night, and then they get very bitter when they see this new car pulling in into Mammy and Daddy's house next door. So it's, I suppose, it's just considering, we'll say, you know, like farms are asset rich and cash poor, and you know, what provisions have been made for other family members, what they have received so far, what can the farmer afford to pay. Sites, I suppose, what I would say about sites is really they should only be brought into consideration if the child is actually going to build a house on the farm. I mean, a thing of retaining it, like if there is, I always go through like each of the family members. Are they married, single, where are they based? You know, so they could be, well, they're all in Dublin, they're working, they own houses in Dublin, and then you go, well, what are the chances of them moving home and actually building a house? Well, they might, you know, wouldn't it be lovely? They could do a summer house. And you're going, like, realistically, you know, when the parents are not around, they're not going to come anymore home, or it'll be, you know, it'll be rare when they will come home. So I'd be saying, just be realistic about that. So then maybe they're still of an age where they want to keep their options open. So what I would be suggesting is, okay, either the parents retain that bit of land where it potentially will be the site, or the other option is that they transfer the farm over to the child, but that they identify potentially where the sites will be. So rather than doing a transfer and saying a right to take a site, say son or daughter has a right to take a site, and then you're effectively like sterilising the whole farm, I'd be saying, let's just put that burden on, we'll say 2 or 3 acres, where there is a good chance you will actually get the site. Because otherwise, if you think about it, if the child wants to go and borrow money, the bank wants the first legal charge, they see this burden of a site for the other family members, they have to go then, cap in hand, to ask them to sign off on it, whereas it would have been much easier if the majority of the farm was unburdened, and but yet there was provision there for the site. The dwelling house right of residence versus keeping full ownership. So most farm transfers I would do, the dwelling house would go with the farm. A lot of the reason being, my question always would be, if the farmhouse is retained and if it was sold to somebody that was not from the country or from a farming background, mightn't necessarily like the smells that go with the farm, could they potentially impact the running of the farm? And if the answer is yes, I'm saying the house should go with the farm. And again, it can, I suppose, typically, and I'm not speaking as a mother, mothers have a romantic idea, we leave the house amongst the girls, shouldn't it be lovely? But then you go, realistically, what's going to happen? Like, if they're not going to come down, the house will fall into disrepair, they'll keep it there, but when it comes to the next generation, when your first cousins owning the house, what's going to happen then? There's a good chance it'll be sold, and it could cause issues. So typically, the house to be transferred over, and again it's around agricultural relief and it qualifying as an agricultural asset, and that they would retain a right to residence. Again, I suppose there's the argument there about, is it a general right to residence, or is it exclusive right to residence, and your exclusive right to residence is akin to a life interest, so negative tax consequences there. Support maintenance. So again, I suppose the usual is a right to be supported in the lifestyle that they're accustomed to. So what does that mean? And that's, I think, where sometimes other family members can get involved and go, well, Mammy and Daddy aren't being looked after, that you were after getting the farm now, and that they're not being cared for the way they should be cared for, and can cause a bit of conflict amongst the family. So my preference is to have a separate support and maintenance deed, and to specify either an annual lump sum payment that will be paid, so that the parents know A, exactly what they're getting every year, and B, the child knows exactly what they have to pay. And so how you work out that payment is, one, I suppose, what do the parents need to live comfortably, their other income. typically it might just be the state pension, they mightn't have other sources of income, so what extra do they need to live comfortably? B would be what can the child afford to pay, so if the farm is being transferred over, is there debt going with it? What other outgoings do they have? Do they have a full-time job off farm? You know, if they're being handed a farm that's in great condition with the farmhouse, no debt, they don't have to do much capital investment, you'd expect a much bigger sum back in the support and maintenance, as opposed to where they might be taking on a lot of debt and where facilities need to be upgraded. And then the third thing is, what's the farm capable of generating? I had a case where it was a small sheep and beef enterprise. I think the average return or profit would have been about 8,000 or 10,000 a year, and the dad decided he wanted 40,000 back per year. So that was a difficult conversation, but eventually I think they all kind of saw a bit more sense in it. Nursing home care, it's the main reason why I find in practice that people are transferring family farms. They don't want to put the farm at risk of the nursing home scheme. So actually I did an interview actually for the radio earlier, a couple of months ago, and the Department of Health had emailed me. We'd been in contact actually with the radio, was in touch with them. So they just gave an update on where the Fair Deal scheme is, and obviously it's been put back because of Brexit and the priority that's been given to it. But they have said that yes, there will be a cap put on the farm assets, you know, that's the plan for the 3 years, but it will still be subject to the farmer having actively farmed the land up to the date they need the nursing home care, and also that there is a successor that's going to take over the farm and take it over for a specified period. So that's going to apply to kind of current and we'd say future applications for the Fair Deal scheme. So again, something to be borne in mind if someone comes to you and say, I'm thinking of releasing out the farm. Yes, that's fine, but beware of the implications in the Fair Deal and beware of the implications on a claim for business relief. So the only thing I think is going to change is that this bit about having a sudden illness, that's not going to apply, but the other conditions are going to apply. And the other thing is, you know, sort of farmers would say they're not willing to risk 1% in the Fair Deal scheme, never mind 22.5%. So I don't think it's going to be a huge difference when they actually bring in this legislation change. And it was interesting because the circular came from the media, the press office in the Department of Health. And at the end of it, they did say, our kind of, might have been exactly these words, but our advice is in line with government policy, assets should be transferred. That's the way to protect the farm from the Fair Deal scheme, and have them transferred 5 years before you need your nursing home care. I remember saying that in an interview a couple of years ago, and Pat Kenny asked me on afterwards and absolutely went through me for a shortcut on the radio about it, but I was like, that's the way you protect them, is you just get them out of your name. Prenuptial agreements, cohabitance agreements, I have only been asked once to draft a prenuptial agreement in my 11 years of practice, and it was never actually signed because it was putting too much pressure on the relationship. So it annoys me a little bit every time ploughing comes up. It's a big topic of conversation, prenups, and you know, farmers don't want to, are afraid of the farm they don't want to transfer it over because of what's going to happen, etc., etc. But I don't know, maybe it's a case of when they come to me, they've kind of got peace with that aspect of it, but it doesn't really factor in the conversations that I have with farmers. Okay, so just, I suppose, if you are doing a family farm transfer, the first thing I always say is arrange the evaluations, and you know, there's typically, I know valuers are regulated by the PSRA, but there typically still is a range within which they can value it, and most of the time I'd be saying pull it up to the higher one, because okay, you might end up, even if you're paying 1% stamp duty, if you've missed the boat with the young trained farmer, aren't you better to pay 1% stamp duty now and save 33% tax on maybe CGT down the line if it's the case that you go to sell some of the land or a site or whatever. The charge on the land, that typically delays the succession process because you will have to get the consent from the bank before you do the transfer, and typically that involves a restructure then where the child would have to take out a mortgage in their own name. Co-op share transfer, I'm only putting this in because they're often forgotten about. A lot of with certain co-ops now at the moment, the supply of milk is linked to you having co-op shares, so that you need a certain minimum of shares in order to supply milk to that particular co-op. So that it's important that the co-op shares would be transferred to, we call it to the farming child, if that is the case. They're typically forgotten about, even in wills, or people kind of forget to even have them because they typically have a nominal value. So I think they're typically regarded as non-agricultural assets, unfortunately. So as I said, they have a nominal value, well, apart from the carry shares, but that's a whole different presentation. But just remember it. And then there's another thing, this is called milk supply agreements. They came in 2015. Again, only some of the co-ops have them, not all of them. So they kind of tie a farmer into supplying that particular co-op for a minimum of 5 years. And there's kind of difficult onerous get-out clauses in those milk supply agreements. So maybe just to look for a copy of them, or at least to tell your clients that you need to notify the co-op that the milk account has to be transferred over to the younger generation. The schemes, okay, I have a good working knowledge of the schemes, but I would always say, I'd caveat it and say, go talk to your tax advisor, your agricultural consultant, because they are just, there's a myriad of problems with these different payments, and the rules change every year. They can change several times during the year, and based on legacy issues and historical values and all that, it's very important that they go to their agricultural consultant or advisor. I suppose on a general level, okay, typically you have your basic payment scheme entitlements, which would belong to the farmer. They would transfer over to the child. The cut-off date from, I would recite them in the deed, but that's not enough. You need to have them transferred over with the Department of Agriculture, and the cut-off date is the 15th of May every year. So it doesn't mean that if you miss that date that you can't do a farm transfer. You certainly can. But if the parent has applied for the entitlements in their own name, so if they put in their application the 15th of May, they can transfer the farm until at least the 1st of June. And then they transfer the entitlements the following 15th of May. GLOS is the environmental scheme that's replaced REPS. And there's a 5-year contract typically with GLOS, but a child can step into the shoes. But again, the Department of Agriculture has to be notified that the child is taking over the contract. The ENC payment, it's called the Area of Natural Constraint, formerly the disadvantaged area. That's only for people that have poor land, so you wouldn't have any clients with that kind of land. So that's not necessarily something that goes with the person or goes with the land. There's a maximum payment, I think it's based on 40 hectares, about 100 acres, so you either get it or you don't, depending on how much land you're farming. And then there's this one called the BDGP, Beef Data Genomic Payment, something to do with beef. Don't know too much about it, but again, it's a payment and it's linked to having a contract with a certain period of time. So just to be mindful that, if the parent is in all these different schemes, and then if they're seen as stopping farming, it can trigger clawbacks of these different payments. Rights away, again, I could do another whole talk about that. I suppose the important thing to say is that we know that rights away have to be registered by, they should be, by the end of November 2021. So I think it's an opportune time to have rights away registered if they haven't been registered already. And then because parents might have a relationship with the people over whose land the right of way exists, and they might sign a deed quicker than they might do for the younger generation. So I think it's good to get them sorted. And then pensions, I suppose if the farm is being transferred before the parent reaches retirement age, that they would pay voluntary contributions to make sure that they still qualify for the full pension. Okay, so just if you were doing a testamentary transfer, just a few, again, really practical stuff, but check titles when you're drafting the will. We're all so familiar with where someone might say, I'm giving this field to someone and this field to somebody else, or they might talk about one farm where there's so many acres and mix them up. And so I would always, as a matter of course, I don't know if other people do it, but I would always check the title and just make sure, I suppose, as well, the title is as it should be, because people think it's all fine, and it's only when you go, actually that bit of land is still registered in your father's name, or that's Registry of Deeds title, where the title deeds, and just different aspects. So I'd always check the title. Then to check his property in joint names. Typically people don't know, or they might assume, they say, oh yeah, it's in myself and my wife's name, but half the time it isn't. Oh, I paid now to get that done, why isn't that done? So, didn't pay me now, but it was whoever they did pay at the time. So then, as I said, land registry or registry of deeds title. You know, if the testator is subdividing a folio, I insist on getting a properly drawn map, because the arguments that can happen over a strip of land or a bit of a building or something like that. So I say, if you get an engineer to draw it up on a property and a land registry compliant map, there's less chance of fallout afterwards. What is to happen to debt owed on the property? Now, with a lot of farms, there is debt owed. It's to be paid off, it's to come out of the residues, it's to be paid off by people that are inheriting parcels of land. If it's land has been left to a couple of different people, what way is that to work? Stock and machinery, what exactly does the testator own? Because with these registered farm partnerships now, typically the stock and the machinery, or even just farm partnerships in general, the stock and machinery are transferred into the partnership and become a partnership asset, so that part of the stock and machinery might belong to, we'll call it the father, and part of it might belong to the son. So it's just identifying that who owns what, and being aware of it and getting instructions at the time the will is being made. A farm trading account. Okay, as you know, with farming, it's seasonal. There's animals bought at certain times of the year and there's animals sold at certain times of the year. So, you know, especially on the beef side of it, you know, if there's animals, a lot of animals have been sold, we say before the winter, there's a big chunk of money there sitting in a bank account. And then, God forbid, if the farmer were to die at that particular time, most of his assets is tied up actually in money rather than stock. So it's to make provision in the will that the bequest is conditional on investing in agricultural property. You know, that thing where you, basically if you invest in agricultural property within 2 years' money, that will qualify for agricultural relief. Because you don't want the money to tip the scales in terms of the 80-20 test with the farmer qualifying for ag relief. And again, I suppose the schemes, not to forget when you're drafting a will, not to forget the entitlements. Lots you wouldn't necessarily specify or the likes of the VDGP, because they're typically specific to the actual farmer. And then, non-contributory pensions and clawback from the recipient's estate. There's plenty of farmers that still have the non-contributory pension, and when they're applying for their pension, and sure, I needn't tell them about that account, they'll never find that out, or I needn't tell them about that thing, and then when their inland revenue affidavit goes into the Department of Social Welfare, it's a whole different story. And then there's, you know, there can be a clawback from the estate, so it's just really making them aware that this information will all become available when they close their eyes, and that it could impact on the next generation, and there can be a clawback from their estate, and how that's going to impact, I suppose, on the provisions that are in their will. The basic payment scheme entitlement. So there was a rule change in November 17. So since then, where the entitlements, where the will is silent essentially, so they don't mention entitlements, they pass with whoever gets the land, unless there's a legal impediment preventing the transfer. And then, so for debts prior to the 21st of 17, the previous case applies, which is that basically the entitlements would typically fall into the residue if they weren't mentioned in the will. But obviously if they are mentioned in the will, they'll go to whoever they have been left to. Long-term leasing, not going to spend too much time on this, because, you know, the notes, just main points, I suppose. The rental income includes the rent and the entitlements, so you can get back the entitlements tax-free. Where land is co-owned, each co-owner can qualify for the tax relief. So sometimes then people say, before they lease it out, they say, oh sure, geez, I'll put the land into joint names before we lease it out, and then we'll get double the income tax lease exemption. Two things to be wary of there. One is that if they plan on transferring the farm to a child, or we'll say during their lifetime, the wife probably won't qualify for retirement relief, because she won't be able to prove that she was farming it for 10 years before she first leased it. There's ways around it, but it's just to flag that issue. And the second issue would be that where assets are, as we know, transfers between spouses are generally tax exempt, but if the transfer happens after the transferor is 65 years of age or 55 years of age or over, it eats into their 750,000, 500,000 retirement relief threshold. So just be mindful of that. So there was a condition there that the person that owned the land leasing it out had to be 40, because that was removed. You can also lease the land to companies. That wasn't allowed a couple of years ago, but now it is allowed. Only a natural person can claim that lease exemption, so if the land is owned by a company or corporate, it wouldn't be available to them. And the farmer can lease out the land for up to 25 years and still avail of CGT retirement relief. So I had a client, I had a consultation with his potential client and had an estate, and more or less it had all agreed to the lease, and it was a 10 or 15 year lease or something, and we were going through all the provisions, and then just at the end I was just, I was saying, and when did you inherit it, and how long have you been farming it? And he'd been farming it for 8 years. So I was like, you'd be mad. I said to Lisa, why don't you just hold on for another 2 years? So it turned out he did, so the lease never went ahead, but hopefully he'll be back to me in 2 years. And then there's a stamp duty exemption on long-term leases that just came out in July of last year, so a lot of people aren't aware of it. So the lease typically has to be for a minimum of 6 years, so you don't have to pay stamp duty in the lease. Collaborative, I'm literally just going to list them. As I said, there's loads of information available. I have a bit more about registered farm partnerships and succession farm partnerships. There's contract rearing, share milking, cow leasing, and equity partnerships. So these registered farm partnerships are incredibly popular. The cut-off date was the 31st of March, and each year now it's been pulled back to the end of February. So you have to have them in by the end of February in order to qualify for the different schemes and incentives from, within the Department of Agriculture point of view. So there's tax incentives for them, so the young farmers get 100% stock relief. The other partners, so typically it would be the father or the mother, would get 50% rather than their 25% stock relief. And then these succession farm partnerships, you can get a tax credit of $5,000 per year for 5 years. The Department of Agriculture incentives, the young farmer qualifies for what's called the young farmer scheme top up. So it works out at about 64, 70 euros per hectare, up to a maximum of 50 hectares. So it's an extra 3,200 euros per year for 5 years. TAMS is the main driver behind it. This TAMS is, so we'll say if they wanted to put up new buildings or a new milking parlour or modernise the facilities that are on the farm, they'll qualify for increased grant aid. So the young farmer will qualify for 60% in the first 80,000 they spend, and then the other partner will qualify for 40% in the next 80,000. So it would be like putting in a milking parlour or something like that you could claim back 80,000 out of 160,000 of a spend. With LOS, that's the environmental scheme, you typically can get, before you could just qualify for one payment of $5,000. Now you can qualify for 2 sets of loss, so that could be up to 10,000. And there's a collaborative farming grant, so that's very important for us as practitioners, because the farmers can claim back 50% of the cost, legal costs, tax costs, or whatever advisory costs in putting these farm partnerships in place. So I might have increased my bill a small bit for doing registered farm partnerships, but then I counteract it by saying you get 50% of it back from the department, so it's a win-win. So the main thing to remember, so you can do what's called a tax partnership, register for revenue, do your partnership agreement, a specimen agreement available, and everything is fine. Or you can go a step further with the registered farm partnership, which means that you qualify for these different tax incentives and Department of Agriculture incentives. And the main thing to remember, I suppose, if you take anything away from the farm partnerships, is that you need two, we call it anchor partners. So you need a partner from category 1, which is a person who's been farming in their own right for 2 years, and they need to be bringing, we call it land, to the partnership. Or 2, and the second category is that basically a young trained farmer with the green cert or an agricultural qualification, and they have to be getting 20% of the profit from the the farm. So like even if the farm is being transferred over, you could still do a registered farm partnership, but the parent would have to be bringing some land to the partnership to be able to tick the box as a category 1 partner. So it's typically a minimum of 3 hectares, but what I would often say is, you know, if they're renting in some land, let the father say that he's contributing that 3 hectares that is in his name. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that the parent would have to retain 3 hectares in order to continue farming in the partnership. So there's, you know, you need a written partnership agreement, a joint bank account, you have to have a profit sharing ratio. So I suppose the thing, like before, the partnerships were overseen to a certain extent by Tavish and Moore Park. So it's kind of a lackadaisical thing, you know, you sent in your few bits of paper and it was fine, you got your number. Now the registration body is the department, so I suppose they're accountable to the EU and it's regarded as state aid, so they can do a system of checks and balances on it. So before you put in, okay, the profit share is 80-20, but sure, we'll see what the way things are looking at the end of every year and we'll do it in the most tax efficient way. But now, if you are going to change the profit share, well then you have to write to the Department of Agriculture within 21 days and they can come out and they audit, and they have done, and they have deregistered partnerships, and I've seen 1 or 2 of them where it has happened. And the main reasons being is that like the whole idea behind it is that the young person is actively involved in the running and management of the partnership. And one of them stands out in my mind is that whatever payments were coming back from the department were going into a joint account. It was an oversight by the parent, but like it was set up with the department that it was a joint account between the parents, and they just never changed it to the account between the mother, the father and the son. But what they were doing is that the money was coming into the parents' joint account and they were flipping it onto this other account. But once the department came out and saw what was going on, they just struck it down, and that was the end of it. So it's very important that, I suppose, what you sign up to in terms of these partnerships, that you actually do it in practice. The succession farm partnerships is a relatively new phenomenon. The register opened for applications from the 1st of June 2017. Basically, I suppose what that it is that the parent signs up to say that they're going to transfer 80% of their assets between years 3 and years 10 of the partnership. So they make a commitment and then you qualify for a tax credit of $5,000 per year for 5 years. So there hasn't been a huge number of them yet. I think a lot of it being because you can't start transferring assets until year 3, and anyone that will be looking at doing a farm transfer is coming near the 35 years anyway, so they don't have those 3 years to play around with. I'm not a fan of them. I'm nervous about them, where you sign up to do something in like 10 years time, all that can happen in that time. Someone dies, something happens to the child, there's a marital breakdown, or just, I kind of figure my preference is if you decide you're going to transfer the farm, you're going to do X, Y and Z, do it. If you're not ready, don't do it. I don't think there's enough of incentive with the $5,000 per year to be taking that risk, and I think as practitioners we should be very wary of it as well, because a lot of things can go wrong with them. Cap reform, there's not a whole pile I can say. The new scheme was meant to be coming in 2020 next year, but it's looking more likely it's going to be 2021 now. The main thing I find where it becomes an issue is where people are leasing out their land long term and they're afraid they're going to lose their entitlements. So under the last round of cap reform, if someone had leased out all their land in 2013, they lost their single farm payment entitlements because they weren't actively farming in what was called the reference year in 2013. So what they typically did was that they sold their entitlements to the person leasing the farm, and they got 2.5 times the value of their entitlement. So say their annual payment was 20,000. Well then by May 2014, they sold those entitlements. They typically got 2.5 times the value, so they got 50 grand for it. A week before the deadline for doing this application, Minister Noonan announced a CGT exemption, so they got 50 grand into their back pocket tax-free. Not a bad day, I figure. And then, as it transpired, the land then was called what we call naked land. So young farmers could go in and apply for entitlements under the National Reserve. So then this which they could walk away with again. So then this like naked land became really valuable because these young guys wanted to go in and get these free entitlements. So they were getting a premium then for leasing out their land at the next stage because they didn't have these entitlements coming with them. So I suppose that's what I would say, that people that are nervous about leasing out entitlements, the last time, you know, it was seen that they lost their entitlements, but did they really lose out? The second thing I would say about it is that the rule has changed a little bit since then, which says that if you sell entitlements without selling land, you suffer a clawback of 20% automatically of those entitlements to the National Reserve. So again, just to highlight that to clients, that if they do sell the entitlements without the land down the road, they might lose 20% of the value of them. But who knows what value entitlements will have in a couple of years' time. So that covers off on that. Okay, stamp duty, I'm running over already. Yes, so the stamp duty relief, so there's a 70,000 cap now in the stamp duty relief. So it applies to the young trained farmer, stock relief and succession farm partnerships. And there's a look back. So for anyone that claimed stock relief or stamp duty relief since the 1st of July 2014. So really what we have to do is, what I've done certainly anyway, is that you have your, you know, your stamp duty declaration that you get your clients to sign. So you have to add in a bit going, have you claimed this relief? What have you claimed since the 1st of July 2014? So just to cover yourself. The other thing is that there was revenue guidance issued just in the last couple of days, well maybe last couple of weeks, sorry, because the way I was interpreting it was that in terms of calculating how much of your cap you had used, you could take into account, you know, the consanguinity relief, the 1%, rather than having to take your 6% stamp duty. Now there was other accountants and fairly prominent agri accountants have taken a different view, which was making us all very nervous about it. But thankfully, Revenue came back and clarified and said, yes, you can take it, that the 1%, you can take the consanguinity into account. So it's not as restrictive as we thought it initially was. One, CGT restructuring relief, again, I'm just highlighting, raising it for you, flagging it. I have dealing with a transaction at the moment where there is a farmer buying land, he's paying 1.6 million for it. He is selling a parcel, he will be selling a parcel for 250 grand, and as a result he's only paying 1% stamp duty and he's 1.6 million. So it's a huge tax saving measure. So again, it only came in recently, but in terms of tax structuring, to try and you know, do it in a tax efficient way. And so there's a relief there as well for the stamp duty consolidation relief. So very good guidance again available from Revenue on that. So I suppose to get that relief, basically you have to do a purchase and a sale within 2 years, within 24 months, and then you have to get, the initial sale has to happen before the end of this year. That's for the CGT restructuring, and you have to get Tagish to certify that it ticks the box of the relief. They're not certifying the relief applies, but they're saying that you satisfy the conditions. And similar, as I said, with the stamp duty, so it's a huge benefit. Transfer of a site from a parent to a child. One thing I just will mention is that before it had to transfer, the site had to transfer to the child. There's a change in the Finance Act which says that now we can transfer to the child and their spouse, which is great. That we don't have that restriction anymore, because we used to have to go off and try to get their independent legal advice. Obviously there is the implication there with the cash and we call it the daughter-in-law or whatever being you know, in the Group C threshold, but from a CGT perspective it certainly is very helpful. Consanguinity relief, so it's their 1% stamp duty, so if the person isn't going to qualify for the young trained farmer, they typically qualify for the 1% under consanguinity relief. Another one just to be mindful of, if you're claiming any of these reliefs, you need to get the successor, the child or the transferee to complete this My Farm, My Plan and get it certified by Tagish. Really important. Has to be certified before the transfer actually takes place. It's a condition of these different reliefs. So it's been around, it's recent enough with the young trained farmer stamp duty relief. It's been around a while for the other ones. So it's available online. If you Google young trained or Google My Farm, My Plan, it'll come up. So it's just, again, it's just making we call it the child aware of it. So that's it, that's as much as I'd say. I know there's an awful lot in it, the presentation is there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Aisling will be with us for a question and answer session, so if you do have any questions for Aisling, we'll take them now.
I'd love to. I'm actually going down to a board meeting, would you believe, and I'm involved with this charitable organisation called Embrace Farm. I don't know if any of you know it. It's basically for people that have been killed, families that have been affected by farm accidents, killed in farm accidents or really badly injured. So I'm on the board of that, and they do absolutely brilliant work. So we have a board meeting this evening at 5, so I'm going to try and get out of Dublin if I can to try and make that. But
well,
yeah.
Your presentation was extremely comprehensive. I think the message is probably if you have an agricultural client, to send one to Aisling.
I love it. Yeah.
But we really appreciate your time.
No, I suppose, and like just to say, like obviously I'd love like any referrals that I could get, but at the same time I just do agri, don't do anything. I have no interest in doing anything outside of agriculture. You know from today, it's just I'm farming mad. So you keep your clients, I don't want them. I just, if there's anything agri related, either I'm happy to advise we call it in the background, or just happy to advise on a specific thing. I actually work an awful lot with accountants, not so much with lawyers, but this is the nature of it. So no, would be absolutely delighted, and at the same time obviously do not hesitate to pick up the phone, because I do it sometimes too, because I don't know anything. I don't work in anything outside of farming, but it's great to know people in different areas. It's always being able to refer someone on, I think, and if you can give that kind of a service to your client, you're doing well. So
Great. Thank you very much.
all right, no problem.
Last but certainly not least, we have our final speaker, Nicola Carl. Nicola is a barrister practicing here in Dublin, and she specialises in the area of probate, succession law, trusts, property law and landlord and tenants, and she's going to give us a talk about limitation periods, which I know Judge Baker touched on this morning. Do you have any slides, Nicola? Yeah, I'll touch.
Hello everybody, thank you for that introduction, Gronia, and thank you for the opportunity of speaking here today. So yes, the title of my paper is